Hello, I'm Corinna Harrod, and this is the Monday Night Review. Hello, and welcome to episode 82 of the Monday Night Review. I'd like to start off by giving my husband Joe a big shout out because he's made me a fire. He's shut me into the sitting room so I don't have to go outside to my office. And he's upstairs balling socks. Very good husbanding up there. Though he is having a conversation on his phone and he is the loudest man in the world ever. So if you can hear someone talking in the background, that's him. And if you can hear weird snoring noises, that's Mouse. I also want to thank Paul, who gave a really generous donation to the podcast. He's basically like my Father Christmas. And speaking of Christmas, I know that for some people it's not an easy time. I'm feeling super stressed because, having thought I was being really organised, I had just made a big ADHD pile of stuff, which I'm now having to deal with. And I'm not feeling that festive. But my Christmas tree is up. And I love my family, so I'm just going to allow things to happen. But I know that for some people it is a really difficult time. And I want the podcast to be your moral support. So we're going to go into Christmas with some true crime. And we're coming out of Christmas with some spooky hauntings. Though today's episode, less true crime, more unsolved mystery, I'd say, as we are going to talk about the disappearance of the Sodder children. Giorgio Sodder is born in Sardinia in Italy in 1895, and in 1908 he travels to America with his older brother, who, on clearing Ellis Island, nopes out of there. Basically, he decides that he just doesn't want to not be in Italy, so he goes straight back, which, I mean, I kind of admire knowing what you want, but that's one hell of a journey to make, to not even really set foot on proper New York soil before deciding that it's not for you. I wonder what time of year they arrived. I can never understand, my Italian friends know, I can never really understand an Italian who doesn't live in Italy. So Giorgio, 13-year-old Giorgio, is left to make his own way. And one of the first things he does is change his name to George. So Giorgio Sodder becomes George Sodder. And he is a boy, and then a man who'd always had very strong opinions that he didn't mind voicing. But he would rarely talk about why he'd left Italy or his life before he arrived in New York. He's not afraid of hard work, so he goes straight away and gets a job on the Pennsylvania Railroad, carrying water and other supplies to workers, basically stuff that a 13-year-old could do. 1908, 13 is basically an adult, so he starts off with that. And then after a few years, he goes to Smithers in West Virginia to work as a driver. And being a man of ambition, he eventually starts his own trucking company, initially hauling dirt to construction sites to fill holes and then hauling mined coal. Also, is it actually possible for anyone born in the era of The Simpsons to say Smithers without thinking of Mr. Burns? Probably not. So whilst in Smithers, he walks into a shop called the Music Box, and there he meets the owner's daughter, Jenny Cipriani, I believe you would pronounce it as, who had emigrated from Italy when she was 3, and they hit it off, they start dating, and eventually they'd get married. Hurrah! Obviously, this being this podcast, that's not the end of the story, as much as I would like it to be. So the Sodders settled outside nearby Fayetteville in a sizable 2-story timber frame house 2 miles north of the town. Now, Fayetteville had some places say small, some say large. So let's go for medium-sized, active population of Italian immigrants. And the Sodders felt very settled, very happy, and they became a very respected middle-class family. Now, in 1923, they had their first child and would go on to have 9 more over the next 20 years. Though they were popular, George's strong opinions sometimes caused problems, especially when he was vocally anti-Italian dictator Benito Mussolini and his regime, which is kind of acceptable now, less acceptable at the time. This led to some strong arguments with other members of the Italian community, but his business continues to thrive. I don't think it really affects his family. They're happy and healthy. And I think it's just sort of one of those things. So the last of the Sodder children, Sylvia, was born in 1942, by which time their second oldest son, 21-year-old Joe, had left home to serve in the army during World War II. There's a lot of kids to keep up with. Joe doesn't feature again. So in 1943, Mussolini is deposed and executed in 1945. And though George is obviously happy about this, his criticism of the dictator had left some hard feelings amongst his Italian neighbours. In October 1945, a visiting life insurance salesman came to the house to try and sell George life insurance for his children. George refused, and angry after being rebuffed, the salesman told George that his house would go up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed for all the dirty remarks you've been making about Mussolini. Which seems quite specific and not great for business, I'd have thought. There's, no waiting to see if the customer is going to change his mind and get in contact with you later after a comment like that. George doesn't really think anything of it, but then another visitor comes to the house, apparently seeking work with George's company, I think, or whether he wanted to work on the property. And he goes round to the back of the house and he warns George that a pair of fuse boxes would, quote, cause a fire someday. This is particularly odd because George had just had a new electric stove installed and had had the local electric company to come and check over the electrics to make sure that everything was fine, and they had checked everything and declared it all safe. Again, George doesn't really think anything of this. He's probably quite smug in the knowledge that he's just had his electrics checked. So now we get to Christmas Eve 1945, and the Sodder family are ready to celebrate. 17-year-old Marion had brought home new toys for her younger siblings from her job at the dime store, which sounds so much better than like Poundland, which is probably our equivalent. And George and the two older boys, 22-year-old John and 16-year-old George Jr., had spent the day working with their father. They'd all gone upstairs and were already asleep. And Jenny is ready for bed, Jenny the mum. So it's 10 o'clock. The younger kids wanted to stay up late. 10 o'clock's not late if you're Italian. So Jenny says, fine, stay up late. That's okay, as long as 14-year-old Morris and 9-year-old Louis remember to put the cows in, feed the chickens, lock the animals up for the night. And she then goes upstairs with 2-year-old Sylvia to bed. Sylvia has a cot in her parents' room. That's that. So Jenny then wakes up at 12:30 a.m. by the telephone ringing. So not a lot of people at the time would have had a telephone. In fact, they've got a telephone, they've got a new electric stove installed, shows you business is going well for George. So she goes downstairs to George's office to answer it. And on the other end is a female caller whose voice she doesn't recognise. And the woman asks to speak to someone who Jenny had never heard of before. In the background, Jenny can hear laughing and glasses and the sound of a party. And so she tells the caller that she's reached the wrong number, though she would later recall the woman's weird laugh. But Jenny hangs up the phone and she's about to go back to bed, but she notices that the lights downstairs are still on and the curtains aren't drawn. Two things that the children would normally have done if they stayed up later than their parents. 17-year-old Marion's fallen asleep on the living room sofa. So Jenny just assumes that the other kids have gone up to the attic where they slept. She draws the curtains, turns out the lights, and goes back to bed herself. Then at 1 a.m, Jenny's again awakened, but this time by the sound of an object hitting the house's roof with a loud bang, and then it's the sound of it rolling down the roof. So she is awake, she's listening, she hears nothing else, and so she goes back to sleep, but wakes up again half an hour later smelling smoke. So Jenny gets up and finds that the room George used for his office is on fire, mostly around the telephone line and the fuse box. And she wakes up George, and he wakes the older sons, and both parents and 4 of the children, Marion, who was asleep on the sofa, 2-year-old Sylvia, John and George Jr., escape from the house, frantically shouting to the children upstairs, but they hear no response. They couldn't themselves go up to the attic, as the stairs up to the attic are on fire. So far, this is a sad tale, but not that strange. But it's the next bit that needs some thinking about, because as the family try to rescue the 5 children in the attic, everything seems to be against them. The phone did not work, so Marion runs to a neighbour's house to call the Fayetteville Fire Department. A driver on a nearby road has seen the flames in the house and goes to a nearby pub also to try and call the fire department. Both are unable to get through to an operator. There's no operator there. Now, whether that's due to it being Christmas, whether that's due to there not being as many numbers because of the war being on, whatever is going on, they cannot get through. And eventually, the neighbour would get through using another phone in the middle of town. Meanwhile, back at the Sodder house, George, barefoot, climbs up the house's outside wall and breaks open an attic window, cutting his arm really badly in the process. And the plan was that he and his older sons were going to get their ladder, climb through the attic window, and rescue the other children. When they go to get the ladder from its usual place leaning up against the house, it was not there, and they can't find it anywhere nearby. So George then goes to the big water barrel. He's going to use the water to try and put out the fire. It's completely frozen solid. So he then decides that he's going to pull, he's got 2 big work trucks that he uses for hauling coal. And he decides that he's going to pull them right up to the side of the house, climb on top of them to get to the attic window. But neither of the trucks would work, despite having worked perfectly for them to use for work the previous day. So the 6 members of the Sodder family who had managed to get out of the house have no choice but to watch the house burn and collapse. So the 6 members of the Sodder family who have managed to get out of the house have no choice but to watch the house burn down and collapse over the next 45 minutes. Remember, this house is timber framed. It goes up and burns incredibly quickly. Some say 45 minutes at maximum. And they're assuming the other 5 children are trapped inside and die in the fire. There's no sound from the children, no sign of them, but obviously smoke inhalation, and it's incredibly fast. So the poor family just have to watch as the house disintegrates. Now, because of the war, the fire department are low on manpower, and when they eventually hear of the fire, they have to call each other to raise the alarm. They don't get to the Sodder house until later that morning. To make matters worse, Chief F.J. Morris was unable to drive the fire truck. Now, in some cases I've read this as in he was unable to drive the fire truck, he couldn't drive the fire truck. And in some instances it reads as if, as chief, he believed it was beneath him to drive the fire truck. Now, I like to try and think the best of everybody, but what we'll talk about with Morris later, perhaps he did think he was too important to drive the fire truck. So he just had to wait until someone turned up to drive the fire truck. He's a really weird man for a lot of reasons that we're going to get into, but one being that he would later say the house was going to burn down so quickly there was no point in them getting there any faster. I mean, a ladder to the attic might have helped Morris. You know, moral support, some specialised knowledge, anything at that point. One of the firefighters was Jenny's brother, but by the time they arrived on the scene, there was little they could do but look through the ashes that were left in the Sodder's basement. By 10 a.m, Morris told the Sodders that they'd not found any bones, as might have been expected if the other children had been in the house when it burned. And according to one account, they did find a few bone fragments and internal organs, but chose not to tell the family to avoid distressing them, though the family had just helplessly watched their home burn down. So it probably wouldn't have been any more distressing to know that something had been found. It's also been noted by modern fire professionals that their search was cursory at best, and to be fair, they were probably volunteers in the face of necessity, and the actual firefighters are in war. So, nevertheless, Morris believed that the 5 children unaccounted for had died in the fire, despite there being no evidence for this, but understandable. As far as we know, the children were asleep in the attic. The house burns down. The children haven't got out. And he suggests that the fire had been hot enough to burn their bodies completely, which I'm going to go out on a limb and say is scientifically unlikely. It's not just the lack of bones and teeth that's strange. Apart from the odd comments from the 2 visitors to the house in the months before the fire, in the weeks before Christmas that year, George and Jenny's older sons had noticed a strange car parked along the main highway through town, its occupants apparently watching the younger Sodder children as they returned from school. In his first interview with the police, John said that he had gone up to the attic to alert his siblings sleeping there, though he later changed his story to say that he only called up there and did not actually see them. Some theories maintain that the first account is more likely to be true if you're interviewing someone, but John felt guilty for not getting his siblings out, so he changed his story. But I think at the age of 22, you would get your siblings. If you were in their room and the house was on fire, you have enough of kids around. You're one of the oldest siblings of 10 kids. You know enough about them to know what ages are capable of what. And any under 10, at least, I'd say, would need shooing out of the house if there's a fire in the house in the middle of the night. Whether they're scared, whether they're really sleepy, whether they're just confused. And from what I know of big families, the older children, especially if you consider John is 22, Betty is 4 or 5, you have a certain responsibility to your younger siblings. And I feel like if he'd gone up there, he would have ushered them out. So we also know that the stairs up to the attic was on fire, so we don't know whether it seems unlikely that he'd be able to get up there and back down without any of his family noticing and corroborating this story that he went upstairs in time for the stairs to become impassable. So that's unclear. The local coroner convened an inquest for the next day, and this held that the fire was an accident caused by faulty wiring. Again, this is weird. Surely they would be able to speak to the local electrical company that would confirm that it had recently checked the wiring and signed it off as safe. We'd later find out that among the jurors was the man who had threatened George that his house would be burned down and his children destroyed in retribution for his anti-Mussolini remarks. Now, I know this is 1945, but I would have thought that this was an obvious bias and that man shouldn't have been allowed in the jury. Now, Fire Chief Morris, my least favourite person in this story, told George to leave the site undisturbed so that the State Fire Marshal's office could conduct a more thorough investigation. This seems like a good move. I'm backing Morris on this one. However, after 4 days, George and Jenny could not bear the sight of the burnt out carcass of the house anymore. So he does what he knows how to do, George. He brings in 5 foot, 1.5 metres of earth over the site with the intention of converting it into a memorial garden for his lost children. I sort of get this. I understand. I mean, thankfully, I don't understand. I hope I never have to understand what it's like to be in their position. But I would be so desperate for any confirmation of how this has happened and what had happened that I would want to wait. I'd almost be fighting off anyone else who tried to go on there so that the fire marshal, the state fire marshal, could come and do a proper investigation to give me some answers. This is even more frustrating when it becomes obvious as to how this event would dominate the Sodders' lives until all of their deaths many years later, down to the children. I believe it's either Joe or John, one of the sons, who would go on to say his family just needed to move on from this and live their lives. But the rest of the family are completely determined to find out what happened. So death certificates for the 5 children are issued on the 30th of December, and George and Jenny are too grief-stricken to attend the funeral on the 2nd of January 1946, although the surviving children did go. And already we see confusion in the media. The local newspaper contradicted itself, stating that all the bodies had been found, but then later in the same story, not even a day apart, same story, reporting that only part of one body was recovered. And this is a contradiction that would go on to this day. Was anything really found in the fire that can confirm that the Sodder children died that night? And really, the answer is no. The Sodder family had to rebuild their lives, but they had questions about the official rulings of the fire. They wondered why, if it had been caused by an electrical problem, the family's Christmas lights and some of their downstairs lights had remained on throughout the fire's early stages, when if there was an electrical problem affecting the power, all the power would have gone out. They later on would find the ladder that had been missing from the side of the house on the night of the fire at the bottom of an embankment 75 feet away from the house. How had it got there? And what timing for it to have mysteriously been put there on the day that it was needed in this fire? A telephone repairman told the Sodders that the house phone line had not been burned through the fire as they'd initially thought, but cut by someone who had been willing and able to climb 14 feet, 4.3 metres, up a pole and reach 2 feet, 61 centimetres, away from the pole to do so. that's quite an extreme climb just to cut a phone line. Now, a man had been seen by neighbours stealing a block and tackle. I am a small woman in Britain. I thought this sounded like fishing equipment. Block and tackle is equipment for lifting heavy things, engines in cars and things like that. So he'd been seen stealing block and tackle from the property around the time of the fire, and he's identified and arrested, and allegedly admits to the theft and claims that he'd been the one to cut the phone line, thinking that it was the power line, but denied having anything to do with the fire. There is no record of this suspect, and it makes no sense to me that someone who is there to steal equipment, useful equipment, would go to the length to climb up a 14-foot pole to cut a power or phone line, whichever line, when there's no evidence that he then wanted to steal anything else. The longer you're there, the more likely you are to get caught. It's one thing to go in and steal something. It's another thing to climb up a pole and cut. The chances of you getting caught are so much higher by doing something like this. So to me, that really doesn't make sense. Jenny said in 1968 that if they had cut the power line, not the phone line, then she and her husband, along with their other 4 children, would never have been able to make it out of the house. Now, I'm not quite sure why this is, whether the lights would have, and the smoke would have prevented them from getting out of the house without, they wouldn't have been able to see anything. I don't know. Jenny in particular had real trouble accepting Morris's belief that all traces of the children's bodies had been burned completely in the fire. Many of the household appliances had been found in the ash, still recognisable, along with fragments of the tin roof, and she became obsessed with what could withstand fire and became a sort of expert in the pathology of fire. She looked at the results from a similar house fire that had killed a family of 7, and their skeletal remains of all the victims were reported to have been found in that case. Jenny burned small piles of animal bones to see if they'd be completely consumed. None ever were. And spoke to an employee of a local crematorium, and she was told that human bones remain even after the bodies are burned at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 1,090 degrees centigrade, for 2 hours, far longer and far hotter than the house fire could have been. It's not unusual for those who work at crematoriums to have to bash up, for want of a better term, bones of those who've been cremated and deal with the teeth and bones to give their ashes to relatives, because the fire does not completely destroy bones and teeth. So surely in a fire that burnt for 45 minutes, which isn't that long for the entire building to be consumed, surely there would be some evidence of the 5 children that had supposedly died in this fire. So one day when the family are visiting the site, Sylvia finds a hard rubber object in the yard. Now, if you remember, Jenny heard a loud thud on the roof and then a rolling sound, and George decides that this hard rubber object is from a napalm pineapple bomb that had been used in the wars. But there's no explosion heard, and it's quite a niche weapon. But I wonder if the rubber could be more from something like a cherry bomb, or almost like a Molotov cocktail, something used to set fire to the house. It is timber framed, so it's not particularly hard to set alight. And I think it's likely, for me, that this does have something to do with the fire. you have the thunk and roll on the roof. Then 30 minutes later, the smell of smoke is strong enough to wake Jenny up. It seems very coincidental to me. But because the coroner has ruled this as a fire caused by electrical fault, and we know the fire department did a really bad job, and then the Sodders cover over with dirt, which I find in no way suspicious. I think it's unfortunate. There's obviously very little to go back and look at. Now, in the 1950s, George and Jenny put up a billboard with pictures of their missing children on. For nearly 4 decades, anyone driving down Route 60 near Fayetteville, West Virginia, could see it bearing the grainy images of 5 children, all dark-haired and solemn-eyed, with their names and ages underneath. Morris, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jenny, 8, and Betty, 5. And underneath was a bit of information about what could have happened to them. And the Sodders offered a $5,000 reward for information leading to the recovery of their children, and this soon increased to a $10,000 reward. Now, this billboard only comes down in 1989 after the death of Jenny Sodder. So then came the reports of sightings, as happens with any tragedy like this. A woman claimed to have seen the missing children peering from a passing car while the fire was in progress. Another woman working at a petrol station between Fayetteville and Charleston said she saw the children the morning after the fire. She told police, "I served them breakfast. There was a car with Florida license plates at the tourist court too." A woman at a Charleston hotel saw the children's photos in a newspaper and said that she'd seen 4 of the 5 a week after the fire. The children were accompanied by 2 women and 2 men, all of Italian extraction. She said in a statement, "I do not remember the exact date. However, the entire party did register at the hotel and stayed in a large room with several beds. They registered about midnight. I tried to talk to the children in a friendly manner, but the men appeared hostile and refused to allow me to talk to these children. One of the men looked at me in a hostile manner. He turned around and began talking rapidly in Italian. Immediately, the whole party stopped talking to me. I sensed that I was being frozen out, so I said nothing more. They left early the next morning." Now, I would have thought this would have been quite easy to follow up on if they signed the register. We don't know. The Sodder's truck failure to start also seems strange. George believed they'd been tampered with, perhaps by the same man who stole the block and tackle and cut the phone line, though I don't think that is one and the same man. However, one of George's sons-in-law told the Charleston Gazette-Mail in 2013 that he'd come to believe that George and his sons might have, in their haste to start the trucks, flooded the engines. Though I would have thought you'd know if you'd flooded the engine. I know when I flood the engine on my lawnmower. And they work with those trucks. They know them well. And it's also the sort of thing that's quite easy to check. Did the trucks burn in the fire? Did they get checked by a mechanic? There's frustratingly, although there are books on this, so maybe they go into this in the books. But for me, I would want to know if what was ruled out. Did they check the trucks afterwards? Had they just been flooded? Had they been tampered with? Some accounts have suggested that the wrong number phone call that at the Sodder house that Jenny received was somehow connected to the fire. And I suppose it is nice to think, oh, this creepy laughing woman phones up. But the woman is actually tracked down. She confirmed that it was a wrong number, pissed at a party, no doubt. And though Jenny did think this laughter was very sinister, it's difficult to know whether, in hindsight, after this terrible tragedy, someone with an unfortunate laugh sounds sinister. The Sodders were not to be defeated. They wrote to J. Edgar Hoover, who was president, to request the help of the FBI. He politely refused, writing to them personally and saying it's out of the FBI's jurisdiction. And so they employ a private detective named C.C. Tinsley. And it's Tinsley who discovers that the insurance salesman who'd threatened George with the house burning and his children being destroyed was a member of the coroner's jury that deemed the fire accidental. And he also heard a curious story from a Fayetteville minister about Fire Chief F.J. Morris, who had claimed, at the time, obviously, no remains were found, but he'd confided to the minister that he'd discovered a heart in the ashes. He'd hid it inside a dynamite box and buried it at the scene. But why? If the fire had burned so hot that there were no bones to be found, no teeth to be found, from 5 people, could a human heart be seen and identified? So Tinsley persuades Morris to show him the spot where he buried this heart. And together they dig up the box and they take it straight to a local funeral director who pokes and prods the heart and says, actually, this is a beef liver and it is untouched by fire. How weird is that? Soon after, the Sodders hear rumours that the fire chief had told others that the contents of the box had not been found in the fire at all, that he'd buried the beef liver in the rubble in the hope that finding any remains would placate the family enough to stop the investigation. But why? Do you want to stop the investigation because it's annoying you, which I totally get? You're the fire chief, you're acting fire chief because there's a war on and this terrible tragedy occurs. You've not done a very good job and the family won't leave you alone and you just want it to stop. But maybe move away, or I don't know, but it seems incredibly odd to... It seems that it seems like the work of someone who's quite mentally disturbed to think, I'm just going to go and get some beef liver and say it's a human heart and bury it at the site of this massive tragedy, and no one's going to work out that it's beef liver and it's not been in a fire and it's a perfectly normal thing to do. It's so weird. And also it implicates you. If you're trying to stop a case from continuing, is it because there's something you know? So over the next few years, tips and leads continue to come in. George checks them all out personally. He saw a newspaper photo of some school children in New York, and he's convinced that one of them is his daughter Betty. And he drives to Manhattan in search of the child. Her parents refuse to speak to him. I believe that the police get involved and check the background of the child for George, and it's ruled out as not being Betty. In August 1949, the Sodders decided to start a new search at the fire scene and bring in a Washington, D.C. pathologist named Oscar B. Hunter. And he is incredibly thorough in a way that you wish someone had been thorough in the days immediately after the incident. And he uncovers several small objects, damaged coins, a partly burned dictionary, and several shards of vertebrae. Hunter then sends the bones to the Smithsonian Institution, and they issue the following report. So I'm going to quote from it. The human bones consist of 4 lumbar vertebrae belonging to one individual. Since the transverse recesses are fused, the age of this individual at death should have been 16 or 17 years. The top limit of age should be about 22, since the centra, which you normally fuse at 23, are still unfused. On this basis, the bones show greater skeletal maturation than one would expect for a 14-year-old boy who is the elder missing Sodder child. It is, however, possible, although not probable, that a boy 14 and a half years old to show 16 to 17 maturation. And from what we can tell, Morris, I believe it is, who is 14, was not particularly big or tall or developed for his age, much less 2 years older than his 14 years. The vertebrae also showed no evidence that they'd been exposed to fire at all. The report said it's very strange that no other bones were found in the allegedly careful evacuation of the basement of the house. Noting that the house reportedly burned for only about half an hour or so, it said that one would expect to find the full skeletons of the 5 children rather than only 4 vertebrae. The bones, the report concluded, were most likely in the supply of dirt that George had used to fill the basement to create the memorial for his children. But also, what I find intriguing is if the dictionary is discovered, they find this dictionary made of paper, and they find enough of it to identify it as a dictionary, then the fire is not hot enough to completely destroy a book. So how can that same fire completely destroy all evidence of 5 human bodies? There'd at least be teeth and bones left. I believe there'd probably be more, because the fact that the fire is quick, the fact that it is a timber framed house means it goes up fast and quick. It doesn't have enough time to get that hot, and as far as we know, there's nothing in the house. It doesn't seem to be an electrical fire. There's nothing to cause the fire to get unusually hot. Fire is obviously hot, but there's nothing to concentrate the flames to give them enough time to heat up to any amount. It's horrible and ghastly and quick enough that a dictionary is still identifiable afterwards. A letter then arrives from a woman in St. Louis saying that the oldest girl, Martha, is in a convent there. Another tip comes from Texas, where someone in a bar overhears an incriminating conversation about a long ago Christmas Eve fire in West Virginia. Someone in Florida claims the children are staying with a distant relative of Jenny's, and George travels the country to personally investigate each lead. Every tip that comes in, he goes, he looks, he tries to uncover if there's any truth behind them, and always returns home without any answers. In 1968, more than 20 years after the fire, Jenny went to get the post and finds an envelope that's addressed just to her. It's postmarked from Kentucky with no return address, and inside is a photo of a man in his mid-20s, and on the back is a cryptic handwritten note that reads, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, Lil Boys, A90132 or 35. She and George both see the resemblance to their son Louis, who was 9 at the time of the fire. So he was 9 in 1945, and this is in 1968. So there's various similarities: dark curly hair, dark brown eyes, but they have the same straight, strong nose, the same upward tilt on the left eyebrow, and once again they hire a private detective and send him to Kentucky, and they never hear from this private detective again. Which, obviously, it could just be someone who takes people's money, but and I don't know how they hire him, but I would have thought that you would hire a private detective that you would find quite easy to track down. So it seems a bit weird that they disappear. Anyway, there are lots of theories about what happened. One theory was that the Sodder children were taken by the mafia to pay back George for some unknown reason, maybe why he wouldn't talk about his childhood in Italy. And the Sodders feared that if they published the letter or the name of the town on the postmark that the letter had come from, that some harm might come to their son. Instead, they amend the billboard to include the updated image of Louis and hung an enlarged version of this picture over their fireplace. And George is interviewed and he says, time is running out for us, but we only want to know if they did die in the fire, we want to be convinced. Otherwise, we want to know what happened to them. And he died 1 year later in 1968, still hoping for a break in the case. And after his death, Jenny puts a fence up around her property. She adds rooms to her home. She becomes more of a recluse. And since the fire, she's only worn black as a symbol of mourning for her family, and she continued to do so until her death in 1989. Her children and grandchildren continued the investigation and have come up with numerous theories of their own. The local mafia had tried to recruit George. He'd declined, and this was payback. It seems quite extreme for me because I feel like it's very niche. Or they tried to extort money from him and he refused. The children were kidnapped by someone they knew, someone who'd come in through the unlocked door, told them about the fire, offered to take them somewhere safe. It does seem strange to me that night they'd left the lights on, doors unlocked, curtains open. My small amount of knowledge of large Italian families is that the kids tend to obey their mother and understand responsibility. And Jenny herself thought it was unusual when she went to answer the phone call that the lights were left on and the curtains were open. Of course, the 5 Sodder children might not have survived the night. If they had, and if they'd lived for decades, if it really was Louis in the photograph, they failed to contact their parents only because they wanted to protect them. But from what? It just seems so strange to me that whoever did this had, and I don't know much about the mafia, but it just seems like it's such a long drawn out, 20 years for George, 40 years for Jenny, for not one inkling from any of the 5 children to or no one knowing anything. None of the children dying and someone coming forward and saying that was Betty. It just seems to me so weird that the children would stay silent to protect their parents for all that time. The youngest and last surviving Sodder child, Sylvia, died in 2021 at the age of 79. She didn't believe her siblings died that night and was active in crime sleuthing websites, giving out information if she had it, and engaging with people still interested in her family's mystery and trying to find what happened to her missing siblings. Her very first memories were of that night in 1945, when she was just 2 years old. She never forgot the sight of her father's bleeding arm and the terrible sounds of everyone's screams. And that is the story of the disappearance of the Sodder children. There are so many theories about this, but then also not enough information. It's something I could feel myself getting really lost in, because for 5 children to just vanish into nowhere seems so incredible to me. And there are just so many weird little things. I'd love to know what you think. I hope you all have the most wonderful Christmas. I'm going to be back with you on Boxing Day. Patreons, you will get a mini-sode this week. You didn't get one last week. I was making sure that all episodes were up on our YouTube channel and getting everything as up to date as possible. So Patreons, you'll get a mini-sode this week. All non-Patreons, you will get some spooky tales on Boxing Day. And I hope you just have the most lovely Christmas. And as always, be kind, stay safe, and always check your vaccine before you